Раз, 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 раз. Один, два, три, четыре. Раз, два, три, четыре. Раз, два, три. Раз, 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 раз. Один, два, три, четыре, пять. Все. Микрофон есть, камера есть. На YouTube он выводит. Все.
Using ChatGPT like Google, that's why it feels useless. Try this instead.
So, this is how I became the most dangerous person in the room. One habit changed everything. I replaced social media with micro learning. Now, instead of wasting time on social media, I spend 15 minutes a day actually learning how to use AI for writing, planning, brainstorming, the real work. That's it, just one skill a day. This is the 28-day AI challenge built for beginners over 40. Starts tomorrow. Tap the screen to join us and try the one habit that really makes you unstoppable.
Birjan Isabayev, and I'm honored to welcome you on behalf of Narcos University and Business School of Narcos. Thank you for joining us our seminar, Geopolitics for Business. It's amazing combination, geopolitics and business. But we are living in the change time. Everything is possible. And geopolitics for business, how global power shifts shapes business decisions. U.S. perspective on the Caucasus and Central Asia. I especially welcome our business students. Very glad to see you guys. And extend warm welcome our distinguished speakers, Mr. Roger Baker, Executive Director of Stratford Rail. It's amazing because, you know, many years ago, I suppose it's like almost 25, 30 years, I first time read Stratford. And now one of the founder of this legendary organization on the stage, please. Also, very interesting expert, Amin Jabarov, my very good friend, very focused for geopolitics, and he's represented Heartland think tank. Few words about Heartland and my imagination. Just 1 second. I especially like name Heartland, particularly in the context of our discussion today. If we recall, classical geopolitics of this concept was central to early strategic thinking. Scholars like Halford Maskinder, Paul Holshofer, it's amazing, viewed the heartland as a key geopolitical space shaping a global power. Today, Central Asia once again finds itself at the crossroads of the major global transformation, making this concept highly relevant for both political and the business. So, Amin, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jean. Ladies and gentlemen,
Yes.
thank you so much for coming. Stratford, strategic forecast. When I was a lieutenant in Kazakh army, I just like 15 years ago, 10 years ago, first when we introduced that platform to analyze the world, I was dreaming about creating my own analytical center to some extent to imitate Stratford or to do something like that, but with very regional context from perspective of Kazakhstan, Central Asia, or Central Asia Caucasus community. And we are doing first steps. Yeah. After like 15 years in Kazakh army, I'm in academia and expert field, doing consulting, analytical papers, policy memos, events. We're doing small steps to do something like Stratford in Kazakhstan, in Central Asia. And now we have one of the founders, directors of Stratford here, being our honored guests, speaking together on the same panel. It's a big honor for me. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah, geopolitics. Why? For me, geopolitics is important for business because in Kazakhstan, especially in Kazakh context, when we talk about geopolitics, politics, international relations, security, almost from that felt comes and listen to such topics. Yeah, so it's become very egocentric, snobbish, fancy party when political analysts are talking about the strategies, scenarios, forecasting, foresights. But like it's rare, it rarely applies to real some real activities. Yeah, so for me, geopolitics or international security or international relations could be applied to something, yeah, and especially in the world where well, I don't want to use the word the word in terms of work culture, but liberal word in terms of capital movement, flow of capital, yeah, geopolitics, understanding of geopolitics, basics of geopolitics is very needed to business, to decision makers, because yeah, during the Soviet Union time, we had a big government and no business. Yeah. Nowadays, government is small and business is big. Yeah. Business companies, they influence the decisions, influence societies, impact societies. And decision making for them, for someone who is not in politics, uh, they need consultancy from someone who is in politics, in geopolitics, who understands this. Yeah, that the main purpose of the politics should serve decision makers. Yeah, in both terms, not only government but also business entities. Uh, and as you know, we live in a very turbulent time. Yeah. Um, just a couple of years ago, in university, we started asking question about this. What is the sanctions? Can the sanctions apply to Kazakhstan business communities, entities? Yeah, because we never were hit by sanctions. Yeah. Uh, Now I see in LinkedIn, in different digital platforms, calls for sanctions, how to learn how to understand international sanction, how that works. Yeah, that's something new for us. Yeah, maybe other countries, yeah, they repressed, or how to say, fired other countries by using the sanction, but we never experienced that. Yeah, supply chain, suddenly McDonald's left the country, suddenly with the internet, all the supply chains were coming from were disrupted. Yeah. Uh, what is the other alternatives? Middle corridor, new term. Yeah. What is the middle corridor? Is there really a corridor? Yeah. Or there is nothing, and we just by our imagination and projection, trying to create new understanding of this world. Yeah. And um, another thing, what is very interesting about the geopolitics studies, I myself, I teach bachelor degrees in Nakhos University IR students. And in IR, we discuss post-colonialism, we discuss liberalism, we discuss social constructivism, identities, ideas, we discuss continuation of the colonial effect of the colony. We discuss Edward Said, but like in geopolitics, it all doesn't matter. Yeah. In geopolitics, China and Singapore are not equal. Yeah. But if you look through the UN Charter, yeah, the very child of the liberalism, yeah, the Singapore and China has the same rights in international arena, yeah, in international affairs, yeah. But geopolitics, the very core of geopolitics is that we are not equal in international relations. We are not equal, and that inequality comes from geography, resources, opportunities. Yeah, and there's very interesting. Roger, you know him, Tim Marshall. Yeah, his book, the Prisoners of Geography, where he talks about geography and the politics. You know, the war explains the war through the perspective of geography, and he kind of debunks the Edward Said. Despite that, I love Edward Said. I teach Edward Said. I talk about post-colonialism. But when we talk real politics, yeah, real politics, we use geopolitics. Yeah, we look to things differently when academic writes a policy memo, not the academic paper, let's say to government, he would look to the things through geopolitics. He would never write something to Tokayev saying that because of the colonial relations, we should. It does not work. No, say we have resources, we need to protect them. The supply chain disrupted. We need different routes. We need access to the roads, yeah, to export our resources. Let it be through Caucasus, Pakistan, China, Iran, different roads, yeah. But we need to find something, yeah. In this term, geopolitics helps not only decision makers but like all entities to understand properly what are the solution, yeah. Why also I like exactly structure. They give foresight, yeah. They're forecasting, yeah. They are writing different scenarios, which is also I'm not accepted in academics. In academic paper, you don't write about the future. You don't forecast. You don't foresight. Yeah, you write. You trying, to answer the question of the ontology. Yeah, what is real, what is epistemology, how the knowledge is built, but not. You don't talk about the future, how the scenario will go. Yeah, and this scenario writing, different scenario writings, different scenarios. It mostly it gives the two decision makers full picture. Yeah, what is going on and what will happen in the future. Yeah. Thank you so much. I want to give the word to Roger. Yeah, he will do the rest of the job. The main.
No, I'm moderator. Don't forget about this.
Sorry.
Thank you, Emin, for your
Thank you so much.
very interesting speech. I want to emphasize that today's seminar is not just an academic discussion. It's a practical guide for your future in business. The insight you gain about geopolitical analysis and strategic foresight will help you become more agile and informed managers in a globalization economy. I encourage you to engage actively, ask questions, think about these global dynamics, relate to local business challenges, and consider how international cooperation might shape your own career opportunities. So, it's now my pleasure to introduce again our second speaker, Mr. Roger Baker. He is the Executive Director of Stratfor Rain, one of the world leading geopolitical and very interesting strategic intelligence organization. Don't afraid this. Mr. Baker has many years experience analyzing global political and economic trends and advising business and institution on risk and strategy. His insights help decision makers understand how global power shifts translate into the real opportunities and challenge for companies. As again, very happy to see you, and please, Roger.
So thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. We'll see if these slides work. I do have pictures. Well, we'll start before the pictures come up. The first thing I want to say is that, as we've heard in discussing the idea of geopolitics as a field has traditionally been something that is used by governments, militaries for thinking about national level strategy. And geopolitics helps companies sort of think about where they are in the world. What are their risks? What are their opportunities? What are the strengths that they have inherent within their geography? And how does that relate to other places? So when we think about geopolitics, it's normally about setting national policy and national priorities. When you look at most readings about geopolitics, it's mostly these days, public writing is mostly what I would call punditry. It's people writing to say, we think this should be this way, we think this should be this way. When we take geopolitics and move it into the space of business, into what we'll call applied geopolitics, we remove the ideas of what should be. We're not trying to say, how should countries interact with each other? How should governments set policies? What we're trying to identify is, what will the international system be like that businesses, organizations, NGOs will be operating in? If you bring it down to its most basic, why do companies care about geopolitics? They care about geopolitics because it creates friction or it facilitates the movement of goods, people, ideas, and capital across borders. No company any longer is not an international company. Everybody is connected to supply chains somewhere. Whatever product, unless all you're doing is like using your bare hands to tear off tree limbs and weave them into something, there are connections to the rest of the world that come into the tools that you use, that come into the communications channels that you use, that come into the raw materials, that come into the goods that you sell. So even if you don't see yourself in business as being an international business, you are dependent upon the flow of international business. And understanding how that world structure changes and being able to anticipate future direction allows you to identify risk, which is easy. It's always easy to identify risk. Everything is risk, right? But to identify opportunity, to find the spaces that allow you to have competitive advantage, that allow you to leap into a new niche that's opening up. And that's the real value as we look at this. So I want to start with a structural concept of the world. I will argue, and many people will argue, that the world system, a single unified world system, starts around 1500, the year 1500. And that's when Europe is dividing up the world. And yeah, but when no longer can things operate in one region and not have an impact on another region. What Halford Mackinder, as we heard before, said, he called it a closed world system. So something happens here, it's going to ripple out, right? It's going to have impacts in other places. Something happens in the United States, it's going to have an impact across the globe. Not because the United States is better than anybody, not because it has the right to have an impact, but simply because it continues to be the single largest economic and military power in the world. And it's like a drunk gorilla wandering around a room. It can bump into things with no intent, and it's going to have an impact. Right. So the world has connections all the way across. It doesn't matter. We can't live in separate systems. Within that internationalized system, there are different periods of time that define different ways in which it operates, particularly for the ideas of trade. And trade we'll talk about a lot because that's the core of when we think about international business. If you go back to the end of World War II, at the end of World War II, there was only one economically viable country in the world, and it was the United States. Europe was decimated, Asia was decimated, most of the global south had not started to really rise up. You're still at the early part of the post-colonial movement. Industrial capacity was heavily concentrated in the United States and ultimately in rebuilding of Europe. At that time, you had the Soviet Union coming out with a particular set of ideologies and you had the United States and Western Europe with a particular set of ideologies at a moment where 2 world wars and a bunch of regional wars had broken the world system completely. And it was ripe to be rebuilt completely new. And effectively, how the West defined international relations, they didn't always follow it. Don't worry that there's hypocrisy in everything. But it was 3 things were necessary for countries to be economically viable and modern. Number 1, they had to believe in free trade. Again, don't complain that it wasn't always free trade, but free trade was important. The idea that things should move freely around the world. Number 2, that the government should have minimal interference with business. The markets should be free and let the markets dictate. Again, don't worry that it wasn't true, but that was the idea. And then the third piece of the Western, what ultimately turns into the Western liberal philosophy of economics, is that the individual is more important than the group. The rights of the individual are sacrosanct over the rights of the group. And to be part of the North Atlantic consensus that emerged, the United States, Western Europe, ultimately Japan comes in, Korea later, a few countries come in. You largely, if you wanted to be in that trading bloc with those really strong, viable economies, you had to accept those 3 underpinning components, at least rhetorically, if not in reality. And often they were enforced more on other countries than they were on the North Atlantic countries. But that was the model. Competing against it was the Soviet model, the Chinese model, other models in some ways, where the state dictated business. Again, not perfectly. Business had a lot of independent role of the state, but the state dictated business, that markets were controlled by the state, and that the collective was more important than the individual. And there were 2 competing systems that had different economic blocks form around them, that had different military, political, social blocks forming around them. At the end of the Cold War, the North Atlantic countries determined that their system of economic philosophy was universal, inevitable, and therefore everyone would be a part of it. And that was the assertion. I'll show you some numbers here in a minute to show you sort of this domination of the world system. And over and coming out of the end of the Cold War, you had the collapse of the Soviet Union. You had all sorts of change and disruptions. The Cold War was one of the stablest periods in modern history in regards to war and conflict, because the major powers didn't allow local conflicts to turn into global conflagrations. As soon as the Cold War ended, the entire space between the 2 blocks ripped open. And you had from the Balkans all the way up through conflict and war breaking out everywhere. Localized underlying realities that had been there, that had been held compressed, were let loose, and things were fracturing everywhere. The late 1990s were a super chaotic time. We then moved into, it was this brief period that people referred to as, U.S. hegemony or the unipolar moment. It wasn't true. The United States was still running around doing all the things it did in the Cold War. In the Cold War, any change in the relative balance of power could fundamentally alter which side would win. And so the US would run around using the military as a key tool to intervene. There was all sorts of proxy war going on. Coming out of the Cold War, the US kept doing it because that's a tool. And it did it to support democracy. You can force democracy on people by bombing them, apparently. It was just sort of the leftover tool that continued apace. By that period in time, we were already writing that the world was going to start pushing back against the United States, that the world hates imbalance. And you could see the Europeans pulling together and really strengthening the European Union as a counterblock, particularly in the regulatory environment in the global system. You could see ultimately the late 90s, particularly in the first 2 decades of the 2000s, China emerging and then using the tools of the existing international system to strengthen its own view of political philosophy and things of that sort. We ended up with a semi-stable moment where the United States was the center of global military power and security. Europe was the center of the global regulatory environment. As a collective, Europe was the single largest economic bloc in the world. The Europeans, because they had no perceived physical threat, because the United States was shaping everything, were perfectly willing to start moving up Maslow's pyramid and focus on self-actualization rather than basic needs, and passing laws like a chicken needs 3 square miles to run if you're going to sell its eggs. And if anybody wanted to sell into the European system, effectively they had to accept European regulations. So Europe could start to shape the global regulatory environment. And China, not the biggest economy, but China sat at the middle of global economic activity. Almost everything in this room has passed through China at some point. Okay, and so it became critical to global supply chains and the structure of things. That stability is gone. And we are moving back into what I would argue is the normal world system from 1500 until 1950. And that is a multipolar world. Not multipolar in an assertion that it should be multipolar to count, multipolar in a basic reality. At no point, even during the peak colonial time, was any one power completely dominant or only facing off against one other bloc. It was always a group. And what a multipolar world does is it puts middle powers with a greater role and responsibility in their region. Regional dynamics reassert themselves. The big powers are changing and looking at things separately rather than looking at a whole global system. I want to run through a couple of things here, and then you will have lots of time for Q&A, but it worked once. All right. So if we go back and if we think about, there we go. So this is, which you can't see because I'm sitting in front of it. This is the share of, no, it's not big. This is the share of world GDP, not GDP, PPP, not anything like that. It's just raw numbers. And if you go back to 1960, and 1960 was the peak of the US-European industrial power. The West accounted for more than 70% of total global GDP. Today, it's about 50%. The rest of the world, the BRIC line, by the way, is almost only China. So forget the others. They barely count. But the BRIC line is China. And you can see China is about 18% of global GDP right now. The US is sitting at about 25, 26% of global GDP. So still a huge gap, but a huge change in that. Well, most of the rest of the world did not come from the same historical economic philosophy as the North Atlantic. And they have been asserting, particularly since the 2010s, that they should have a right to reshape and redefine global norms. And they're a greater component of the global economy. So we have not to throw out the system, reshape the system. Not China create a block around themselves and try to isolate themselves from all of the West, but China trying to use the system to start tweaking it. And what China has done in its economic growth is proven to the world that the assertion that the Western liberal economic order was inevitable and universal is false, because China was able to become economically successful without asserting the tenets of the individual over the state, the market, or totally free from government intervention, and trade being entirely outside of government control. And so that is a huge challenge to things. Well, there we go. This chart behind me is what is driving US thinking today. Okay. And this chart shows manufacturing value add from 1990 up until 2024 on here. What manufacturing value add is basically what percent of your economy is from manufacturing. All right. So you can see in here where China suddenly became the manufacturer to the world. And the United States really reduced manufacturing as the component of global economic activity. It wasn't as significant. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the United States is falling. There are other types of economic activity. It moves to services, et cetera, et cetera. But the perception that we have after the last 15 years of short, sharp supply chain disruptions is that if a country cannot be more self-sufficient in their own manufacturing, they are really vulnerable to intentional or unintentional disruptions to the international system. And there are going to be more and more disruptions as we move away from the last 30, 40 years of economic norms into the new system over. That worked. While this is happening, what we've seen is direct structural challenges to the idea that the West dominates international markets, international finance, and things of that sort. So China has been the center of setting up new institutions and organizations that provide economic assistance, economic investment, without most of the additional political requirements that came from the West. So if you were to look at trade agreements from 1990 until about 2020, you'll see that there are a ton of brand new trade agreements that are struck around the world after the end of the Cold War. And over time, those trade agreements become more and more complex. In other words, rather than being about trade, they're about trade, politics, society, gender equality, all sorts of other things that go into the writing of the trade agreement that is outside of trade. They take a really long time to negotiate. They are very long in their explanation, and they don't change very quickly. NAFTA was signed before the iPhone was invented. How was NAFTA adaptable to that? Well, you couldn't adapt NAFTA, so it had to be completely changed or rewritten. And what we're seeing now is a move back to unilateral, bilateral, shorter, less complex trade arrangements and trade agreements. And we're seeing a surge in trade agreements between countries and regions that have been delayed for years because of the perception of US disruption to the world system. That everyone is trying to find ways to buffer. No single trade arrangement is likely to replace the relationship with the United States, but multiple give countries more option. So what that means, if you're thinking from a business perspective, is that the expectations that you have that everyone is slowly moving to a common global regulatory framework is no longer valid. Trade arrangements, trade agreements, cross-border arrangements and agreements are going to be shorter term, more volatile, change more frequently, and be different in different parts of the world. And it requires a greater awareness of what's going on in the countries, how they're acting, things of that sort. So let's talk a little bit about some of the ways that we see geopolitical risks express themselves in traditional risk. And one of the things that I'll argue, which will be throwing my job in the garbage, is that there is no such thing as geopolitical risk. And what I will say is that geopolitics provides you with a way to look at risk holistically, to look at all of the different avenues of risk, because geopolitical risk expresses itself in traditional risk categories that you're already aware of: supply chain risk, regulatory risk, shipping and disruption risks, all of those types of risks. People have mechanisms within their organizations to think about, but they're not thinking about them in a holistic, inclusive manner, which is what geopolitics helps us do. So as we look at risk, what are some of the ones that we see coming up more frequently these days? We have financial, economic, trade, and tariff risks, right? If you look at the lovely chart of US tariffs, it has really changed and shaken up the world system. We don't expect those tariffs to stay at that level for another 4 or 5 years. We think that they're going to change and come down and be adjusted. A large number of them are going to be struck down by the Supreme Court, but they are disruptive nonetheless, and they are already changing patterns and behaviors of companies as they look to alter where they're going to get supplies from, what markets they're going to sell into, or whether or not they start chopping their companies in half and having a Asia for Asia half, a Europe for Europe half, a US for US half company, and start breaking their companies apart. We see war and conflict risk. right? Traditionally, when you would hear geopolitical risk, this is what people were talking about. War and conflict is geopolitical risk. That's a real oversimplification. But when we think about these risks, right? Somebody mentioned McDonald's not being here anymore. Well, why is McDonald's not here anymore? Well, we had a war here that then created other types of stresses that then changed dynamics in Russia, which then changed dynamics. Nothing here that had anything to do with that war, but it has ripples that come back. Think about the change in the rail transit across Eurasia, where China traditionally was running it through the northern route. It would pop up into Russia and come out somewhere over into Europe. Because of the conflict, they're shifting it to a southern route. China had nothing to do with the war. They are adapting and adjusting. So the impacts and implications are not just what's happening in this frontier or what's happening to Ukraine or what's happening in the Black Sea. They have secondary, tertiary, quaternary. It ripples out, and we want to be aware and look at that. We have disruptions to maritime routes, right? Sometimes those disruptions are, people lobbing missiles at them. There are alternate routes, but what happens when you have to shift route? When you have to shift route, you add time. When you add time, you not only add time to that good that you're moving, but only a certain number of ships and a certain number of containers. If your ship takes 2 extra weeks, that's also 2 extra weeks that another cargo couldn't be loaded and moved. So it starts to create double, triple, quadruple backups in the entire system. You start getting changed routes, changed cost structures, things of that sort. You have areas where you have subsea disruptions that are taking place. You have military exercises randomly scheduled that basically create 1 to 3 day delays in the movement of ships through particular regions of critical goods. And those all have compounded impacts over time as we think about them. We have lingering, long-term, over-the-horizon. I mean, Korea has been a crisis since 1953. What crisis or not, every year somebody asks me, when is North Korea going to nuke South Korea or the United States, right? China, Taiwan, every year the question is, when will China invade Taiwan? There are these long-term realities. A lot of what's happening in the Middle East is these long-term realities that suddenly have their flare-up. We want to be aware of these without being freaked out by them all the time. We want to think about key elements of supply chain. So rare earths or critical minerals are the big debate. What is the strategic choke point of critical minerals? Processing. It's not minehead. They're available at lots of mineheads. It's about processing and processing cost. And it's about the IP for new processing models and methods, and that IP is largely controlled in China because they're the dominant processor of most of these minerals. So there's a processing issue that goes into it that ultimately has an impact on technology supply chains. So what's the battleground today? It's the AI battleground, right? Who's going to dominate AI? Who gets chips? Who doesn't get chips? Where do they come from? China cannot produce chips without Japan. Japan cannot produce its chips without China. Both of them need Taiwan. They are fighting each other. China just canceled all flights for the entire month from China to Japan. China's tourism is actually a huge economic lever that Beijing uses because tourists don't go where they want to go. They go where the state-run tourist companies say they can go. And if the state-run tourist company says you can't go, they don't go. How did China get its first aircraft carrier out of Turkey? Anybody know? Out of the Black Sea? Because it was not under its own power, so it wasn't allowed to travel through the strait. Do you know how they convinced the Turks to do it? They promised tourists. And tourists equal cash. So they promised tourists. That was their payment. It was in tourists. When there were stresses with South Korea, ahead of South Korea hosting the Winter Olympics over the THAAD deployment, the Chinese simply discouraged Chinese people from going to the South Korean Olympics. Well, who were supposed to be filling all of the stadium seats? The Chinese. South Koreans did not make any money on the Olympics. Nobody makes money on Olympics, but they really didn't make any money on the Olympics because lots of the people that were expecting to come never came. Huge economic lever without anything official, without anything formal. So when we think about the way that countries express themselves in these, they don't always respond to the item with the same item. They find other levers and other tools that are going on. So one of the things you have to be able to do as you're thinking in geopolitical terms is understand the countries themselves. What are their net strengths or capabilities? Why do they have imbalances in particular relationships that hurt them less than it hurts somebody else, that they can turn on or off to influence things politically? Rarely does it have to go to military action, and the Chinese have become very adept at using economic tools rather than military tools. The US is getting back into economic tools, but still sort of blunt force. The Chinese are very clever. If there is a stress between the United States and the Chinese over a particular trade and tariff, the Chinese will pick one brand of whiskey in the United States that is produced in a state by a senator who is up for re-election, who will do everything he can to convince the president to change the rule so he gets reelected. They don't have to put a ban on everything. Find the targeted piece. Sometimes those trade dynamics create long-term change. US-China soy trade. So the Chinese this year, finally, last year, I think they bought soy once. The United States was the major supplier of soy and soy products to China, mostly for animal feed. As China has urbanized, and as you start thinking about what are the impacts of other countries, when a country urbanizes, it changes its food consumption pattern. Urbanized countries shift heavier and heavier to red meat consumption. Red meat consumption has heavier and heavier inputs of raw commodities into it to produce the same amount of raw protein. And therefore, China's consumption of soy rose as their consumption of red meat rose as they urbanized. They bought that soy from the United States. Then, in a fight with the United States, they cut soy from the United States, shifted to Brazil. They invested in Brazil's rail network in the north to be able to more rapidly access Brazilian soy. They changed the structure of Brazil's farms and transportation for their commodities. Now they can pull it from there. If the Chinese, though, decide that they want to make a quick gesture to the United States to ease trade pressure, they can simply buy a lot of US soy. Well, if they buy a huge amount of US soy, what is that going to do for Brazil for half a year? They're not going to buy it, right? And it's not clear that Brazil can quickly adjust in that short time frame to the market, and you have a major economic hit in Brazil. So if you are engaged in relations with Brazil, you have to be intimately aware with US-Chinese trade relations, even if Brazil has no say in the game. And this is happening all over the place. In oil markets, in commodity markets, in raw material markets, mineral markets. All of those inputs are scattered all over the world, but they are vulnerable to larger powers' competition. And what those powers are doing has ripples down in all the way through. What was that slide? Oh, that was the AI one. Okay. So what do you do as a company if you have to pay attention to all of this? Number one, who in a company holds the portfolio for global geopolitical understanding? I mean, if you're in business school, I'm guessing that in your business school classes, it doesn't have you've got the CEO and the CFO, and you've got these departments. Rarely are we seeing in business school somebody saying there needs to be this role. Sometimes it's somebody in the C-suite takes it because they want it. In modern business, it's moved to the corporate risk. Usually the people who work on physical security. And they've been given this portfolio. Well, what's their attention? What's their primary focus? If your job is physical security of people and facilities, are you looking at long strategic things far away from your operations? Or are you looking at short-term things right near your physical operations? You can talk. You're looking at short-term things, right? You're looking at things near you. So they're having to completely redesign that. Supply chains, the teams in supply chains are starting to look at this and pick this up. In regulatory and legal are starting to pick this up. But what we're not seeing in most companies is a unified approach to understand how this impacts each slice and how those slices in the company interact with each other. So one of the things that we work with companies to do and other people work with companies to do is to start to build those frames, to figure out how to build the frame both in the company and how to build the structural frame of the world, of the issues that are going on and things like that. And so you can come up with clever little, assess, anticipate, act, right? Assess my operations. Look at my business. Look at my supply chain 1, 2, and 3 layers deep. Not just my direct suppliers, but who are my suppliers' suppliers? Not just my direct consumers, but who are my consumers' consumers? And start to understand the network that you have. Layer that on top of any one of these companies' global risk maps. And so are there places with routes in different regions where I may be dependent upon something first or second tier, and that dependency could be disrupted because of these things. I now can start to identify potential vulnerable spots fairly quickly. I can then start to build out alternative future models to say what would lead to a change in that space, or how could a change in that space occur? What would I watch to know whether something is going to change? In the United States, everybody was, and Europe in particular, looked at the United States, and when Donald Trump was first elected president and started challenging the international system, everybody in Europe was like, what? This is so weird. Why would somebody do that? We could never have anticipated that. President Barack Obama stopped allowing new members to the appellate body of the World Trade Organization and broke the back of the World Trade Organization. The United States, prior to President Trump, had always started to shift and say the change in China's role in reshaping and redesigning the international system to fit their needs meant that the international system no longer was prioritizing US interests, which is quite frankly what it was designed to do. And therefore, they needed to start fracturing and breaking that. The WTO appellate body was being used as a tool by other countries to hamper or hinder, from the US perspective, US trade and US trade access. So it was not an anomalous Donald Trump. It was a structural change that was happening. And in many ways, Donald Trump reflected the change that was coming up through society also, rather than driving it. Now, don't get me wrong, he drives it in ways that are very different than Barack Obama drove it. But if you were paying attention, some of those quiet moves by the administration and some of the changes in US society, you would have seen this change in broad-based US policy, or the very real potential of it. You would have seen it coming before it expressed itself. And you could have said, not, I'm going to change everything because of that, but if that change happens, what are the opportunities and risks in my organization? How do I look at those opportunities and risks? What are ways I can mitigate or address those opportunities and risks? And are there small things I can do now that are low cost that give me greater flexibility? Right? And some companies were doing that, most weren't. And now everybody is running around trying to find agility, flexibility, things of that sort, not even just resilience. So you can take this is a map of loosely a map of our 10-year forecast. So we build 10-year forecasts every 5 years, trying to just look at what are the big global trends, where do we see certain frictions and things like that. There's a big report that goes behind this. Lots of companies put out annual risk maps. There's all sorts of different things that happen in there. You can layer these on and take a look at them. We build out scenarios. So in business, if you want to build out global scenarios, if you're doing business scenarios, you're usually doing things like best case, worst case, base case, and looking at things like that. If you're trying to lay out geopolitical scenarios and try to understand the structure of the world, you need to start building plausible future scenarios, not best case, worst case, because those don't help you. You need to say, what are the drivers of this particular trend or issue that I'm looking at? How do I narrow them down instead of adding more of them in there? What are my baseline assumptions? Why are those the assumptions that we have? What would the world look like if my assumptions are accurate? And now start changing assumptions. What if my assumption of this isn't accurate? What if what if I think I think JD Vance is going to be the next president of the United States. And I think that he's going to continue to hold the MAGA movement, and we're going to continue following on Trump policies for 4 years after Trump is done. Well, and that's not my assumption, by the way, but if that was my assumption, then here are 3 or 4 things that would likely come out in the international system. What if my assumption is wrong? So don't worry about whether I'm wrong or not yet. What if my assumption is wrong? What if he's not elected? Or what if he's elected, but he can't bring that momentum in, or he can't control Congress? What does that do to the expectations coming out of the So you can start to work through these scenarios. And you build out 3, 4, 5 scenarios for each issue that you're dealing with. And then you can look at those scenarios and go within an organization and say, okay, marketing department, what does it mean if this is reality? Don't tell me it's not reality. If this is reality, what does it mean? Supply chain team, physical security team, market access folks. What does this mean for you? What would you need to do? How would this change you? And then you can bring all of that back together and look at it as an inclusive whole and start laying out what we think of in strategy. One of the things that we've been finding is that if you go back to the Cold War period and just post-Cold War, companies had country managers all over the place. And they were aware of local nuance and local dynamics, things that weren't written, but everybody knew. And with the end of the Cold War and the victory of the sort of one movement towards common global regulatory frameworks, they changed to the much more cost-effective idea of having, for example, a single person for EMEA. So one person responsible for understanding the entire construct of Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. How much nuance are they going to have? How much they're operating under the assumption that the regulatory environment is staying the same and only very little things could possibly change it, right? And so we've seen companies losing their visibility into these things. Supply chains are not known, sometimes not even across the whole company. I spent 3 years running back and forth to Europe with big companies and said, okay, tell me your first tier supply chain for your company as a whole. And they're like, I can't. This department can tell you theirs, and this department can tell you theirs, and this department. They didn't even know their footprint as a intentional. They had the data, they just didn't look at it. They didn't understand it, didn't pay attention to it. And so they don't know what to do with this. And the other thing is strategic planning and foresight are not being put together. So they're not looking at these scenarios and looking at their strategic planning in the context of the scenarios. They're just doing their strategic planning. They come in once a year, you have somebody talk, they tell them things, they're really interested for 5 minutes, and they set it aside. Or they think about it at the top level, but don't push it down to each of the subunits because you're rewarded on short-term KPIs, particularly in Western style business. It's 3-month blocks, and which means that most of the lean forward is 6 weeks. So as you start thinking about this, if you can build these frameworks, if you can build these models, you can identify indicators. What would I see that would tell me I'm moving towards one model or another? You can already stress test your organization against different futures. You can come up with ideas of what to do about those futures. And you can if you can move your time to decision 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks earlier than your competitors, you win, right, in business. So being able to have good, structured scenario foresights give you some of that. Now, I want to be done with this. Oh, yeah, let me just show you really quick. I want to show you something interesting on this. So this is actually one of the scenario models that we were working with. And it starts, I don't know what the date is over there, way a while ago, and comes here. I want you to look at this scenario model because when we designed the scenario, look at how constant for the first half of this model our expectations were. Our base case up there in the hot pink was like, so I mean, it was flat. Each dot on here represents events or things happening that required us to readdress our scenario. And each of those dots did nothing to our scenario. And then suddenly something happened in the international system. It may have been Donald Trump and tariffs. And everything starts getting thrown out of whack. Now, the interesting thing in here is, what's the highest scenario after all of this chaos? It's the same one we started with. It doesn't always work that way, but in this case, you have this hugely disruptive period, and then that. This is the same chart, but only looking at the disruptive period, right? Where now it's like, I don't even know what's going on, right? Except that my green scenario is never a good scenario, so why did I even have it? It's the useless scenario. One of the things that by building these out gives you is a way to better assess the day-to-day information volatility that we face. Every day, every piece of information is all over the place. If you don't have something to lay it against and say, I've got this piece of information, is it anomalous, first of all? Does it affirm, alter, or make me abandon my expectation? If it affirms my expectation, I don't pay any attention to it. I don't care. I'm not looking for information to prove I'm right. I'm hunting the things that prove I'm wrong, but I have to test them and say, does it really change things? And it gives you a way to manage information volatility. Let me do two other little things, and let's go into Q&A because that's more interesting than me talking at you. Let's go back to geopolitics and thinking about geopolitics as a large structural frame. You can think about geopolitical patterns in different scales of time and different scales of geography. Okay, you can build models of the geopolitics of this campus. You can look at the geography, at the movement of people, at where things concentrate and don't concentrate, and where power is concentrated or not concentrated on campus, and influence and budget and funding and things. And you can actually build a mock geopolitical model of a single campus. You can build a model of the country. You can build a model of Central Asia. You can build a model of bigger Central Asia, right? Everything from the Caucasus all the way to Western China. You can build a model of the world. The scale can be different. You can build models over different time frames. I encourage people to think about basically three layers of geopolitical models when you're working. One is, we'll call it deep geopolitics. And if you're a history major and you had to deal with Braudel ever, you'll know he has the longue durée, he has conjuncture, and then he has l'événement. I can't pronounce French. That's the event. And you can make an analogy in geopolitics as well. You have deep geopolitics, big structural issues, the heartland, right? What is the heartland? The heartland came from looking at historical patterns and showing that through history, there seemed to be movement of basically Central Asia to other parts of the region in surges. You know, and power would come out of that center place and move out to the periphery, and it would be in the center. And the idea was that there was something about that geography that was inaccessible to maritime power. You couldn't get to it. On the outer skirts on the south, you had a whole ring of mountains. Right? You got to get over the Himalayas. You got to get over you got to get through the mountains in Afghanistan. You got to get through the Caucasus. You got to whatever. There's a whole bunch of areas that block you from access to the interior from the sea, right? And that allows power to concentrate in that space and then utilize the population, the resources, and transportation infrastructure of the time to move out. And the argument was that to the north, it was a wall of ice. And therefore, it was completely inaccessible. And that was the heartland argument that was there. And it was built off of history, and then it became an assertion that if rail were added to it, a massive rail network to that space, you could link up the productive capacity with internal lines of communication, so things that maritime powers can't interfere with, the human capacity, the resource capacity of Asia, Europe, and Africa into a single rail island. And if you did that, you could then build the maritime capacity to dominate the rest of the world, because it would by far outcompete the United States, Australia, the UK, any South America. It doesn't matter. Nothing else competes. They all fall to it. That was not a concept that was about, we don't want it or we should fight it, but it was an observation that led to later policy, structural things like that. Deep geopolitics. Now, what has happened in the Arctic in the last 20 years? It's melted, right? It's melting. Okay. I don't care what the cause is. I can tell you it's a reality. I work up on the North Slope of Alaska a lot. It is a fundamentally different place. What happened to the ice shield of Russia? It's gone. If Russia no longer has an ice shield, Russia now has the longest exposed maritime coastline in the world. What did Russia start doing by the late 2000s? Not only building lots of icebreakers, but rebuilding its entire military infrastructure in the Arctic North, and then starting to build out the communications and monitoring and navigation infrastructure for maritime transit. It recognized the vulnerability. 10 years later, the United States said, oh no, the Russians are building up the Arctic and militarizing the Arctic. We need to do something about it. What drove it? A fundamental change in deep geopolitical structures. Then you can come to what I would call contemporary geopolitics. Think of it as generational geopolitics or smaller blocks of time, right? They're not single presidential terms. They're patterns and blocks. The Cold War, you can even subdivide the Cold War. The Cold War was a generational block at a particular pattern of the world system, and you can go into the contemporary geopolitics. Contemporary geopolitics is where it starts to meet business. Deep geopolitics is fun. You can't understand contemporary geopolitics without it. But deep geopolitics has no relevance to business. If you're talking to businesses and talking about the heartland, it's a nice framing concept, sorry. But you really, to make it applicable, you have to start coming down in time and in scope and scale, right? And then you have the events or tactical geopolitics. For the most part, you cannot understand the day-to-day unless you've built those two bigger structures. Otherwise, everything is new and everything is changing. If you know the stock market, there's a volatility index, the VIX. Information has a VIX. And these days, the VIX of information is massive. Every day, it's something different. I know lots of CEOs who call every single day saying, I read this in the news. It's different than what you said yesterday. Has everything changed? And I say, no. And then we go back and we do it again the next day and we do it again. So if you are able to build those frames at the contemporary level or a little lower, you can ease off that day-to-day volatility and know what it is. And the second thing to think about as you're doing this, and then we're definitely in question time, is for the most part, geopolitics asserts that it is an objective tool. The idea is that I can look at it, you can look at it, anybody, we can step back, we can use the methodologies, we can use the tools that we have available, and we can come up with similar assertions about vulnerabilities of countries, relations between countries, things like that. But geopolitics is not the same as realism, as a political philosophy or political ideology. Realism asserts that there is a clear national interest and that leaders will ultimately act in national interest. Geopolitics asserts that I can identify vulnerabilities and I can identify things that should drive particular policy, but it asserts that the individual makes the decision. So think about geopolitics in two slices. There is perceptive geopolitics, and that is, how do the decision makers see and understand the frame that they are looking at? They will make the decisions based on their perception, not based on your objective outside observation. And their perception is shaped by who they are, where they grew up, what's the circle of people around them, what's their life experience, what ways have they understood action, reaction, or impact of things. who advises them, who doesn't advise them, what are the tools they have to use, and what are the tools they don't have to use, right? And it will shape their perception. When you hear arguments, and this is in the US, you hear this a lot, there's no threat of NATO to Russia in Ukraine. That's a false narrative by the Russians. And the Russian perception is it's a totally real narrative because since the end of the Cold War, NATO has expanded not only eastward, but into former Soviet countries. So it's surrounding Russia, right? The argument over whose perception is accurate does nothing. It doesn't help anything. It's great for punditry. It's great for shouting and stuff. It does nothing to understand. If the Russians perceive things in the way that they claim they perceive them or that their actions seem to show they perceive them, then we should anticipate their actions based on their perception. But if we can build a objective framework to understand, we then will understand what the likely outcome is of their action. The choice of decision and the outcome are not the same. I can choose to accomplish something, but it doesn't mean I will accomplish it, right? If I don't have the resources, if I don't have the tools, if I misunderstood the situation, if other things move in counterforce to it, things of that sort. And so what we want to do is learn how to balance perceptive geopolitics. How do I understand how countries and leaders make decisions? And then how do I come back and look at objective and say, what are the impacts and implications on there? And then as I come into company or business, it's not what I like it to be, what isn't. And now if I understand what it is, what are steps I can take to get as close as possible to what I would like the outcome to be? Instead of starting off with an expected a hopeful outcome and then ignoring reality and finding yourself in the opposite direction. So I think I want to stop there, go into further discussion. I think there was plenty of me talking at you.
Thank you so much, Roger. It's a very, very interesting and very practical and useful lecture. So, do you have any questions? Please. Little bit loud, please, or microphone, please.
Thank you. I'm Joel Erickson. I'm based here at Narhos University. I was in Russia for 25 years leading the Fulbright program before moving here about 3 years ago for reasons I probably don't need to explain. Thank you so much for laying out a great institutional understanding of the world and how it works. I thought I'd like to, just for fun, be a little bit provocative from the perspective of Kazakhstan. First of all, I totally agree with you about Russia. I think it's in decline and will become more and more isolated from the rest of the world, based in part on the horrendous decision they made to invade Ukraine, irrespective of their reasons for doing so. However, I would also suggest that for Kazakhstan, the country that shared such a long border, I believe it's the second longest border in the world after the Canadian-US border, and in many ways is attached at the hip to this day to their economy. Beyond that, you brought up variables that you think are important for geopolitics. I might add that demography, no mention was made of that. Access to energy, and then you obviously talked a lot about access to markets, but just if you could look at those three things for Kazakhstan, one of the youngest regions in the world after Africa, place that is oil dependent, but also in this conundrum about transition to renewable energy. And thirdly, regarding water, incredibly critical area for the region, but also one that has to balance with mining, which is terribly destructive to water. So getting back to demography quickly, in a sense, it's between a secondary power and a major power, both of which face major demographic challenges, especially Russia, which is really an aging country, but China too. People don't talk about it much, but it's not a very young country either.
So I'll go back. I didn't do everything, but there is, in geopolitics, what I would say is, in business, if you've done pestle analysis, right? For anybody who's in business, how to do a pest or a pestle analysis, politics, economics, the that basic analysis. In geopolitics, we have a similar framework. And that would be geography and history at each end. And then in the middle, politics, economic, security, society, which is going to pull our demographics in there. And then technology, which is also going to be pulling in a lot of our energy, things of that sort. So we do address all of those. Water security, things like that. I was talking to someone over here, or someone in here, over here, where we're launching a new series that we've just started the research on global demographics and looking at different slices of it. So these are all important pieces. And I think you're absolutely right. We have to look at those. When you look at a country, you have to look at it in its space, right? So if a country has a very large growing or at least a very large young population, there are two general paths that country goes at that moment. And that is, if the country can create opportunity to harness that young population, you see huge booms in economic activity, growth, social activity, all sorts of great stuff. If the country cannot harness it and cannot create opportunity for it, you often see fracture and stress and chaos. There is a small demographic bulge starting in about 1985 in China of college age, high school and college age people. And there was a very small amount of economic opportunity. Well, what happened in 1989 in China? Little Tiananmen Square, right? Tiananmen Square was not caused by the bulge, but the bulge contributed to that. Now, what the Chinese did to manage that demographic excess is they actually did the opposite of what most people expected. And they said, okay, all of our students can go abroad. Rid of them, right? Push them out to take opportunity elsewhere. I think the challenge for a country that's going through that moment is, can the country create the economic opportunity to utilize that population? And it's not just like African countries that we see this boom, or Central Asian countries. There is a large underutilized youth population in Taiwan right now, in Japan right now, in South Korea right now, in very developed countries where the upper end is not retiring and leaving the workforce because they're living too long. People refuse to die. And therefore, they're not opening up new space. The economies are reaching their sort of plateau. They've gotten to as high as they're going to go, and there's not a lot of a well-developed economy does not grow fast, right? It can't. The idea that China would grow at 10% every year forever was silly because it's logarithmic. It doesn't work that way, right? At a certain point, it plateaus out. Those crises are happening in those places. In Taiwan, if you want to go to the coffee shop, they're usually run by somebody with a master's degree, because that's the minimal degree to sell coffee. I think for a place like Kazakhstan is, how do you create opportunity? Right now, there's a potential advantage in the fact that China has invested a ton of infrastructure and transit corridors. And the interesting thing about transit corridors is that, just like in the United States, we saw this, it's not just a pass through. Done well, you can start to build new opportunity along the corridor, right? It creates new spaces, new opportunities, new actions. The ability to access through multiple routes increases the likelihood that other countries who weren't willing to put in the infrastructure might come in and provide additional opportunity. So US companies have been not the fastest. There's a few here, but they're not rushing in, despite the president saying Central Asia is the place to go. Again, there's still a big gap between Western companies and Western governments. The Western governments can't dictate where their companies go, whereas to a great degree, Chinese government dictate where its companies could go and could better utilize those economic levers. So I think that there is that. It's the opportunity question. Can there be opportunity? If you go to the resource issue, I don't think we're anywhere near the end of oil and gas being utilized internationally. At bare minimum, it's utilized for most of the products in this room. It's a precursor product, it's an industrial chemical. I think oil and gas continues. We still use wind. We still use hydropower. We don't throw away the old power sources. But there is all sorts of interesting opportunity. Water is the really critical one. Our long-term outlook on water is really dire. in looking at the expectations and pattern of water, not only in Central Asia, but around the world, which are going to drive things like, ideally, it'll drive bioengineering of crops and increased crop production in places with lower water needs. It'll drive new technologies, but it's also likely to drive outward migration from a lot of places. But at this particular moment in history, there's a moment in the developed world that is very anti-immigration. And there are stresses in the developing world where, because of technology, some of the traditional steps of economic growth are not there. They're being potentially bypassed, but there's outward pressure for migration because there's not sufficient opportunity for these youth populations. And that's going to create a huge amount of stress for the next 10, 12 years. And then we think it's going to start to reverse. And as the old people finally die in the West, and stop just living and living and living and living. And that's a great thing about medical care, right? We're living longer, things like that. But then there's going to be a competition for select labor. And that's going to start drawing from places. I'm not sure I answered any of your question.
Please, you. Microphone, please. Guys, you are sleeping on.
It's okay. Sorry. Roger, great privilege and honor having you at Laos University. I recall, when I worked back in 2016, 2017 at one of the government think tanks in Astana, we have written intensively policy papers for the president and for the Security Council. But what I recall is that, discuss in all these papers, in all these memos, all about dangers and threats, actually. And sometimes it turns paranoid into what you have written and what you have suggested for the government and government agencies and so on. So my concern was that geopolitics was rather, political language or geopolitical mindset was rather making away from the threats and becoming paranoid rather than using this as a tool to find an opportunity for Kazakhstan, for its development, for its expansion, for trade, and so on and so forth. So how to turn this logic and whispers of danger and language of threats into an opportunity and, have this curious thinking at the government level as well. What is your suggestion for that?
So number one, I don't do policy. But you're right. I mean, this is the thing. It's super easy to talk risk. If you open up any paper, everything is about risk. The whole world is ending. Everything is terrible. There's no win. If you step back and don't start by thinking good or bad, right or wrong, only think about effective or ineffective, likely or unlikely in the first phase of analysis. Halford Mackinder's keystone book was called Democratic Ideals and Reality. And it was written at the end of World War I. And what he argued is, if you only allow your ideals to shape the post-war settlement, you're going to create the conditions for the next war. But if you first look at the underlying reality and say, how can I get close to my ideals while being aware of these realities? I will shape things differently. And I may do things slower. I may not do some things. I may delay some, I would be more likely to get to my end goal. I think the first step is to say what is, then to say what are the places where, yes, Kazakhstan's vulnerable. Well, of course it's vulnerable. It's a landlocked country in between China, Russia, the Ottomans, the distant America. I mean, of course it's vulnerable. It's that's just think about poor Mongolia. They only got 2 neighbors, but nothing to sell but gold. But how do you then say, what are the places, what are the risks and vulnerabilities of the neighboring states that we could facilitate to ease that risk for the neighboring state that strengthens our relative position in dialogue and negotiation with them? We're seeing a shift, and this is a natural shift by many countries in the multipolar system to multi-alignment rather than non-alignment or direct alignment. What multi-alignment is intentionally looking and saying, oh, China needs these east-west corridors. We'll facilitate that. Oh, Russia needs north-south corridors. Russia's not too keen on the Chinese, even though they need them, but they're really worried about losing another territory to some other influence and power. So maybe we won't change the rail gauge. We'll keep the Russian rail gauge, keep the Chinese having to lift their trains and move them down. How do we start looking at what can we do to facilitate the north-south corridor for the Russians? How do we balance out that Chinese and Russian bit with, are there ways that we can do a few things to modify the regulations a little bit just to make it a little more encouraging for the American mining company or the European mining company or forget just natural resources. Are there other things and other opportunities that can start to be taken advantage of? And I think that's the way to start looking at it, is not looking at it as, here are all the risks, how do I hide myself in them? But here's my position. Here's the position of the ring around me. Here's the position of the global system. Where can I turn the dial a little so that I'm not as vulnerable because I'm doing something net gain for somebody else, without undermining my own interests, right? Not just giving away stuff, not just being subsumed to somebody else. I think that's interesting. Poland a couple of years ago, when everyone was worried about Trump pulling out of Europe, they're like, we'll open a new base and we'll call it Camp Trump. Small action, huge impact, right? Well, what happens with that? Continued economic flows, continued trade flows, other types of things that come in. Low cost thing, they didn't see it as a threat. They saw it as, hey, we'll take advantage of the stress that's happening next to us in the relationships, and we'll find a way to up that.
Yeah, please. No, this guy. Yeah, please.
Hello, thank you so much, Mr. Baker, for your lecture. My name is Albanis, I'm from Kazakhstan, and I have a question more about like your corporate culture. So how demand is forming your internal structure of your company? What companies are looking for in terms of geopolitics, what they really want to know? Maybe it's more about risk, or maybe it's more about opportunities which arise from risks which you underline in your papers. And how this kind of companies like risk, geopolitical risk advisories, how are they structured? So you might have, let's say, country departments like Central Asia, South Asia, and so on, or you might have people like more focused on some particular topics like CRM, logistics, and so on. Thank you.
So in the field of geopolitical risk analysis, and it's been exploded the last 8-9 years. There's just been tons of new entrants. So when I started in '97, nobody liked the word geopolitics. It was the evil old Haushofer Nazi word. Nobody wanted to talk about it. It was
Since Fukuyama was a very popular one, is that? Yeah, sorry.
yes, and this said it's so you don't need to worry about it anyway. It's all over. But there's lots of companies out there now. Most of them that I've seen structure themselves around either experts. I'm an expert in this. I'm an expert in this. Around, more often than not, they're actually just doing a lot of open source collection, processing, and pushing back out, and not necessarily direct intelligence analysis that's relevant to the company. When we started as a company that had no experts. We want experts. I'm not an expert at anything. Okay. We started with methodology training in traditional tools of intelligence analysis, methodology training in geopolitics, classical geopolitics, methodology training in understanding business, how businesses work, business operations, things of that sort. And if you have a strong methodological framework, you can rapidly gain knowledge and understand it within that methodological context. If you don't, it's very hard to do so. And so we structured the company around people who had areas of responsibility. Some of them were geographic, some of them are thematic, and everything we do weaves them together. So it's not one person sitting there doing their thing, ignoring everybody else. We have every single day, we have a phone call still every single day at the company where all the analysts sit down and talk together about the world every day. So at bare minimum, you're hearing about things in other parts of the world, and you can start making those weird connections that you wouldn't have done if you're only focused on your area. Companies use it. All companies now are starting to at least recognize. If you look at the surveys of C-suites in the West, at least, 60 to 70% rate geopolitical risk as their top risk, or at least top 2 risk. But 15% say they're doing anything about it because they don't know how. Because business schools are not teaching geopolitical thought. It's over in the IR department. It's not for the business school. The business school is talking about the business school things, and they're not talking about this. And you get one class on global business, but it's more, just looking at, oh, here's Vietnam and here's this, but not how do you think about the world in this other framework. Traditionally, the ones who were most connected were extractive industries, because if I'm a mine, I'm going into a place that's usually politically risky. I have a 10 to 15 year ROI, and my asset is a whole that I cannot repatriate. So I really have to be thinking in that long strategic term if I'm in extractive industries. Nowadays, our customer base is financial services, it is high tech, anybody who has a supply chain, which is everybody. So most retail, most manufacturing, a lot of NGOs. NGOs saying, where and how do I anticipate what's next so I can prioritize where I'm going to put my focus, my attention, my resources, because I have a limited amount of resources, where the need's going to be emerging, and also how can I ensure that someplace where I am isn't going to go in a way that's going to put my people at risk. So it's across the board, but there's not a framework yet. So my mission, my personal mission, is to try to work with business schools to build everybody has to be a geopolitician, but to build this as a mindset that carries across all of the other aspects of it. To have that as part of the thought that gives you, as a person in business, a significant strategic advantage, because you can see things in those multiple layers. And you don't have to be the expert. You just have to have that knowledge, be willing to see things in that light.
Yeah, please.
Thanks. Thank you very much for being here. An excellent, really interesting program. My name is Kendrick White, an American, been here almost 4 years, spent 30 years in Russia before that. Mark Carney recently gave a very impassioned speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and he laid out some principles for middle-level countries and how they should group together. In light of the upcoming NAFTA negotiations and how Trump is reacting to that speech, what do you think is really going to happen? Do you think these middle countries are going to be able to gather together and gain some strength, or is it going to be impossible for them to really fight against, the big countries, the U.S. and China? Your opinion on that?
Yeah, so I think the middle countries, I call them the middle powers, whatever you want. And by the way, there's no good definition for it. I went through all the literature. Nobody agrees on what a middle power is. You barely agree on what the great powers are, and then there's all the rest. But the middle powers, right? So you think about obvious ones: Japan, Turkey. These are countries that have a very large role regionally, large influence regionally, have a great amount of capacity, are likely to be playing in there. Now, I do see them becoming much more active, an activist in their region, and reaching out across regions to build better relationships so that they have options. Optionality is the buzzword right now in there. But I don't necessarily see a block of them forming up as a counterpoint to what I put up there is the 2+2 powers, right? The two real big powers are the United States and China. The two medium big powers, I still think Russia is there, even if it's contracted, and Europe is there, whatever form we want to call Europe, right? The idea of Japan, Australia, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Brazil creating it's very hard for that to function. It doesn't mean you're not going to see them trying to find little lines. BRICS is a beautiful example. Okay, first of all, anybody know the origin of BRICS? BRICS was somebody's investment strategy. It had nothing to do with anything else. And it was supposed to be BRICS. Indonesia was supposed to be in there, but it didn't really match the letters, so they dropped it. So it was just BRIC. It was actually just BRIC. There was no S. And then it was BRICS because it was 4 countries. So then China said, let's put South Africa in there so we can get an S and have an African nation in there. So BRICS is not a thing. And if you look at any of the things that hold it together in any unified form, there are none. everybody has different intent, different purpose. It's a whole lot of unilateral relations with China, is what BRICS is, right? It's China using other people's capabilities and things for their interest. Most recently, when you think about the BRICS Bank, bringing in the Gulf states, so that China doesn't have to only spend their money on infrastructure development internationally, So I think it's hard for these countries. Nonetheless, though, I do think this is the moment. We're also going to see a lot more smaller scale regional or affinity, not blocks, but groups forming up. ASEAN is really working to tighten itself, at least the ASEAN core. You'll see some connections between countries that may have similar economic vulnerabilities that'll try to find ways to connect them. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. They're not alliances. They're not formal. They might not even have fancy names. They might because people think it's cool to have names. But I do think that there's more of that. But I'm not sure we're going to see the middle powers be able in far ways to do that. Japan, Australia, definitely keep an eye on those two because they have the same set of strategic interests at two different ends of a particular key transit route. They have a much greater likelihood of doing things with the United States, but also in spite of the United States and separate from them.
Yes, thank you very much. A lot of insights today. My name is Maria Stepanova, and I'm a heartland expert in energy transition. If I got it right, on one of the slides, you pointed that the energy transition is a kind of inevitable thing, yes, despite the Western pushback now. But what is Trump administration doing currently is like it's contradicting it. What are your scenarios for that?
Yeah, so one, the Trump administration is not eternal. It's delaying some things. Energy transition, our view of the energy transition doesn't eliminate pre-existing energy. It adds capacity in other energy. So the way it was being described in the West, particularly in the US, energy transition was get rid of oil and gas and coal and replace it with wind and solar and wind. I come from Texas. Texas is oil. We all know J.R. Ewing, and Texas is oil. Texas has the largest amount of wind generation anywhere in the United States. We're an oil state, okay? Because we got big open flat spaces that are just fine for wind generation. So we think that the pathway is there. And what in the US right now, there's finally a huge nuclear renaissance. And with real money behind it and real regulation change behind it. And that's driven by the data centers. Their demand, their consumption demand. And they're not going to all be built in the size they're saying and stuff like that. But they're going to get particularly the SMR and the microreactor technology over the hurdle. And I think that becomes a big piece of the energy transition. I'm not sure we're going to see, everybody's just going to have wind farms and solar. I think it's a broader based concept. And again, doesn't eliminate oil, doesn't eliminate gas.
But it's about the state of
if they believe in oil and the environment of the space. So look at the comments out of Exxon on Venezuela. Their view is, yeah, Trump did this, but we don't see anything stable that says that we're going to get our money back and it's going to work. And in his first term, he reopened Arctic oil leases in Alaska. Do you know how many sold? None, because it didn't matter. So Trump can say what he wants, and he can try to disrupt things, but the Europeans are slowing some of the application just because we don't want the economic cost. But the pathway is there. I think the new energy is there. It's going to continue to add. Again, to me, it doesn't eliminate the entire conquest of the world in the 1500s was by wind power. We still use wind power today. That was the 1500s.
At the end of the day, drill, baby, drill. So, any questions? Do you have? Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate your speech.
I'm sure you're a great analyst, but today I was convinced that you're a great speaker as well. So I have recently watched your speech at the CFO Summit 2017. And if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned that Russia does not want the Chinese investments, but rather it does want the Japanese investments. Is it relevant today after almost 10 years? Can you elaborate on this topic?
Someone did their homework.
Yeah.
So he's telling about a presentation I did in 9 years ago, in a slightly different dynamic, but a lot of it holds, by the way. A lot of it has been pretty solid. Russia is tremendously nervous about China, but tremendously dependent upon China. The Ukraine war significantly increased that dependency. I was really shocked when Russia, for example, allowed China to use its Coast Guard in Russian Arctic waters and to do joint drilling and allow them to do joint drills in Russian Arctic waters. That was a huge sovereignty issue for the Russians and a huge security issue for them. But they felt compelled to keep that relationship and allow that greater access. The Russians would much prefer to have somebody else's money. But I think that the Russians have put themselves in a position where, then back to perceptions, they overestimate, I think, the US-European chaos. And they think that they can win the United States and leave Europe behind. And any future, not solution, but management in Europe is going to involve Europe. And so the Russians would love to see US investment. They actually love to see European investment. They're still hoping the Germans would want their gas again and things like that. What happened when the Germans had to stop taking Russian gas? Where did German petrochemical industry do? It moved to China. Not necessarily the best thing. I do think that if the Russians had alternatives to China, they would take it, but not yet. But they're not at the point where they are so desperate that they're willing to give up on the Ukraine frontier to try to change that balance. And that's where I would put it. We do have one scenario, we've got a bunch of long-term scenarios on the future of Russia. And you have to, if you're doing a 10-year scenario on the future of Russia, you have to have Putin dead in one of them. You have to have, the successor failure of these economic drives. You have the demographic issues that are, you look at the life expectancy there, it's pretty rough. And we have one of the scenarios that plays out ultimately with a rush for competitive investment and resources and conquest between China and Japan over the Russian Far East. That we're looking at as a potential, not our highest scenario, but a potential plausible future. But I do think if Russia could have someone other than China, they would be happy to. But they are not at such a moment that they are willing to give up what they think they can finally solidify in the Ukrainian frontier. And it's amazing, by the way, what they've lost while focusing on Ukraine. They lost the Caucasus to Turkey. Huge loss, right? And China's playing in there, and they're not gone, but there was a real strategic setback. If you're Armenia and Russia refuses to bail you out, you're going to be, as any power would, looking for 3 or 4 alternatives. Not throw out the Russians because you can't, but look for your alternatives. And so they're when they get done with Ukraine, they're going to have to look at the other parts. Everybody in Europe is focusing on, they're going to look at the Balts. I would argue they're going to look at the Caucasus and Central Asia. And those are the places where they've been not lost, but they are losing influence through Chinese economic actions, primarily in that space. But yes, Japan, if they could, but they can't, so they won't. So they gotta come back. I think if we get a resolution on Ukraine, I think the focus is going to be on the Caucasus and Central Asia first. Yes, they've got forces and things, but I don't see the Russians making a move on the Balts. I do see them trying to strengthen their hand back in their traditional neighborhood.
Thank you, Mr. Baker, for your breathtaking speech. So I would like you now, your political question. So my question is, what of the history China was absolutely hegemon and economic sphere. It manufactured a lot of goods and here it is growing and grows. So after World War happened and China lost its manufacturing power, Europe put down for all over. So it started to be like a global dominance with the euro. But now, after the 19th, we see how China emerging. And sorry, my question is, don't you think that the United States returned the crown of economic hegemony to China after it started to get manufacturing resources to China? And
Sorry, introduce yourself, please.
my name is Milan. I'm a student of international relations at STU. And how long will China hold its hegemonical crown?
So I don't think that we're seeing a hegemonic transition between the United States and China. I don't think we're seeing China take over that role on a global scale. And there's a couple of things that you can look at. So if you go back to when China was an economic power in the pre modern era, pre-1500s, right? It was a regional power. It was an economic regional power, and China was traditionally a land power. And China has almost always been a land power, a continental power. Their playing in the maritime space has been short, usually only when power in China is in southern China, not northern China. Southern China is much more connected to the maritime space. Northern China is very much a continental power. And throughout history, China has been that way. The reason we had the Opium Wars is because the Chinese, they're still good. What did the Chinese want? They had minimal trade. It wasn't dependency trade. The British needed to sell them something to get their money back, right? The British wanted Chinese stuff. The Chinese, it wasn't really there as part of a necessity. If you look at Chinese consumption patterns of commodities and Chinese role in manufacturing and Chinese role in international trade. In the 2000 teens, China shifts from being able to be largely, not completely, but largely self-sufficient as it had been for pretty much its entire history, to being dependent upon international trade. If you are dependent on international trade, how does almost all international trade move? What mode? How does international trade move? How do things move? How do they get from China to anywhere else? By ships, by boats, okay? China is being compelled to change itself, try to be a maritime power while it's still a continental power. China is a classical amphibious power. It has a continental component. It has a maritime compulsion now, where it must shape that maritime space. The United States dominates the global maritime space. China has a little M-shaped ring of islands that close its coastline in. At the archway, the keystone of that is Taiwan. And you go up the Ryukyus, Japan, Korea, you come down the Philippines, Indonesia archipelago up to Malaysia, Singapore, etc. Those hold Chinese in. They cut its north coast and its south coast in half. China has to push out in the maritime space if it's going to be the dominant player internationally. And that's what we see China do, right? Belt and Road Initiative was part of a twofold strategy. One, to diversify export routes so they weren't so vulnerable to the Strait of Malacca. And two, to take interior China, where there was no opportunity and everybody was poor compared to the coast, and have them look west instead of east at their compatriots. Where does revolution start in China? It starts in the interior, not on the coast. The interior looks at the coast, says, you got cool stuff. I don't have cool stuff. I don't like you. I'm going to kill you. So what do? Instead of having them look at their own compatriots who are rich, you have them look west and see opportunity to go west, and you send them that way. And almost all, the bulk of money spent on Belt and Road was spent inside China, in central and western China, not overseas. So that was the drive. The other thing they did is significantly accelerate building a modern navy, an expeditionary navy, a navy that can go out to other places, such that China has a naval overseas port now in Djibouti, and they have arrangements at least to do stopovers and refueling and rearming in lots of other places. They're not there yet. They're not truly a global navy. They're largely a regional navy. They have some expeditionary capability and things like that. They dominate the global merchant marine. They own shipping. Well, the Greeks actually still do, but the Chinese are pretty close, right? It's a pretty close tie. The Greeks are still above them. That's starting to fade. Shipbuilding, they dominate shipbuilding, right? So they've been moving to try to be a maritime power. The problem is they have the most number of land neighbors. Most of their land neighbors are not the most stable or the friendliest. They still have a massive interior that is way underdeveloped compared to the coastline as a potential source of stress. They still have all the challenges of a continental power while they're building out maritime naval power. The last three amphibious powers that tried to become dominant powers, France, Spain, Germany, all failed because they couldn't maintain the maritime side because the land side ultimately became more important for them. I'm not saying that Kazakhstan is going to invade Western China and then the Chinese will have to go to war in Kazakhstan. But what I am saying is that China has a very difficult time shifting to truly secure its maritime routes independent of the United States' largesse allowing those routes to stay secure. And the Chinese government remains very reticent to use military force. They use military coercion, but they don't want to use military force, such that they gave up in South Sudan. They have not intervened yet significantly to protect the corridor to Port. They have not intervened militarily to protect the natural gas pipelines through Myanmar that run and the rail lines that run shortcut. They are not physically using their military as a tool of power, and they're scared to do so because once they do, it changes their relationship with the entire world. They are no different than the Europeans or the Americans who came before them. They're also not entirely confident. The last time the Chinese military was bloodied was in the 1970s, and it didn't do very well. So I think that while China is clearly the competing power, they're trying to keep that in the economic and regulatory space and changing norms. And there are a lot of things that constrain them from truly becoming that successor big power, like we saw the transition from the United Kingdom to the United States. That said, they got lots of nukes and they've built a bunch more.
Yeah, please. Just
I'm professor of economics at Almaty Management University here. Thank you very much for an exciting and really thought-provoking talk. It's really with a pleasure to attend this talk and to listen to your ideas. But I have a kind of different question because it comes from my background. I do some part of decision theory, and my question would be in a sense decision theoretic. It strikes me in recent years that many politicians, global politicians, the news, right, behave think that politics is a performative art. So basically, whatever you think of, whatever you imagine, you are visionary, right? You can meet people. And there are a lot of techniques like media support, propaganda, whatever you call, that would up that idea. Do you share that view? And it seems to go ahead with what you have called realism, right? You can change the world if you have imagination, if you have the leverage to do. And do you share that view? And if so, how do you account for these kind of things in Stratfor in your analysis? Thank you very much in advance.
So in the second half, I don't want to change the world because it's bad for business. If everybody's happy and peaceful, I'm out of a job. So no, but so I do think, we do see a lot of, modern media allows rapid communication to everyone. You go back through time, there are different periods of different ways in media. Think about the change in US politics after the first televised presidential debate. And suddenly you have a new medium, radio before that, each of these things. There was that whole movie a couple of years ago, The King's Speech, right? About the Brit, right? The technologies change the way in which they interact. In the old days, it was build bright pink St. Petersburg, right? And make it look like a French city, and then everybody's happy. We have different ways of making that communication. I think what is likely to ultimately dial that back a little is reality is going to catch up with things. So even though everybody's out and I can do whatever I want and they're saying strange things, and 80% of them, by the way, are never being followed through on. If you match what, for example, President Trump says he's going to do and what he does, most of what he says is not even close to what he does. So there are some constraints on that, but the reality is going to hit. So a leader starts doing things because they think they can do them. At some point, one of them is going to backfire. And it's going to create real physical dynamics that create a little change. And then another one is going to backfire and it's going to create a little change. And I think ultimately we are going to, when we reach a crisis moment, that's when we're going to see a shift in some of these political spaces. When the Ukrainian president was elected, everybody thought it was silly because he was another reality star like Trump. And the Russians interpreted that as, this is a cakewalk. We don't even have to follow basic military protocol. We're not going to take out air defenses before we move our helicopters. We're not going to put any infantry next to our column of supplies, right? Like anything, like the US thought, it's going to flip. Well, the crisis changed him. Initially, he became a caricature of himself, right? He even showed up to the White House in the same T-shirt, right? Got criticized, and now he wears a suit. But there have been real changes in that space because of that crisis. And I think that that's what brings it back. When there isn't a perceived real threat, so I mentioned Maslow's pyramid before, right, out of sociology and psychology, and I have a model in my mind of Maslow's pyramid of nations, right? And there are nations that are way down at the base, Afghanistan, and I feed people, right? The European Union, when we talk about the most strange ideals in the total abstract and forget that reality exists. Most countries are not at those two ends, but sometimes their political structure is way higher than the rest of the country. And at some point that gap breaks and it pulls that political structure back down into reality. And so I think that there are natural cycles that will do it. I'm not a gloom and doom guy. I'm not it's the end of the world or it's all over. Now I have spent almost 30 years being violently agnostic about the world. I don't care. But it doesn't strike me that it's the end of civilization or things like that. That said, for all of you who are younger than 30 or 40, I really encourage you to stop and think about things before you share them and assess them before you pass them on, right? We need to rebuild critical thought processes back into everyday life, not just into one slice of our job. And that will ease some of this sense of utter chaos that we appear to be living in.
I have two questions, sorry, very short. One of them for our lovely auditorium. Do you have someone who is working in American companies here, who is present here? Just, Chinese companies? Just in general, Western companies, Russian companies, other companies, just only you. It's your business students in business school? Okay. So, Okay, so, and Roger, first of all, thank you very much for your time and for very, very interesting lecture in terms of geopolitics. Because it's, to be honest, I suppose all of us understand it's very, very sensitive for all of us. But my question is, just imagine if Republicans in 2026 can lose election campaign in Congress. In that time, leaders like Alice Weidel or Marine Le Pen can win presidential and parliament elections in Germany and France. How it's reflected? It's a geopolitical strategy, especially in terms of the situation in Eastern Europe. This is a very, I suppose, sensitive for us. It's a war in Eastern Europe. It's very sensitive. Please.
So if I understand the question, you're right. What if the left recovers in the US in 2026, but the right really recovers in Europe? Rationally there.
Yeah, living in change and world, you know.
And how does that change things? But I think one of the things that we're seeing off the board is that countries are once again willing to say, now in the past they recognized it, but they weren't willing to say, that there are national self-interests. And that the role of the country is to think of itself first. And if you look at Europe, actually, go to the global economic crisis, 2009, 2010, and watch what happened in Europe. Prior to that, all the European countries were best friends and it didn't matter because everything was going well, money was flowing, there were no stress. As soon as that happened, all of the underlying structures in Europe, the real Europe that sits underneath the pretend European Union, reasserted themselves. How do you solve Greek financial issues with German solutions? Yeah, that didn't work really well, right? So if the Greek leader tried to put in the German dictated policy, the Greek leader was kicked out because who votes for the Greek leader? Not the Germans, the Greeks do. And so somebody else would come in and do an opposite thing because that would be appealing. I think we have to understand local leaders are the ones who get elected, are the ones who can identify the societal concerns and then harness them very quickly. Society moves before politics. Societies have to be shifting and changing shape, and the politicians are able to grab onto that and build it up and then try to rally the society. And then usually the societies have moved on before the politician finishes what they wanted to do. They can't keep it going. So I think if we think about a Europe that moves more right, a United States that would just go into, if the US wins, if the Democrats win in 26, it doesn't end the Republicans. What it does is it just stops policy. This just stops doing things for 2 years. It's just infighting, right? There's the Congress blocks everything the president does. The president uses what it can. Congress is constantly fighting it. It's a mess. That leaves Europe looking to position itself as a single unit entity when the right thinks of national self-interest above regional interest. And therefore you don't have it. Right now, there's no leadership in Europe. Right? There's no strong person in France or Germany to pull Europe together as a unified entity to fill the gap. And I don't see one coming for a while. So if you go to the right, it doesn't bring them in. If you go to the far left, it's not going to bring somebody in. There's somebody floating out there, where's the next Merkel? Where's the next Thatcher? Where's somebody who can at least create that sense that people will look at them, listen, they'll be able to make those little deals and negotiations and bring it along behind them. We don't see that. So I think for Eastern Europe, what's interesting that we're seeing is as democratic countries appear to be going autocratic, the democratic countries that went autocratic are starting to swing back because they've already been through that cycle. And we're seeing the societal pushback there. So there's a mismatch in the timing across Europe. I think for Eastern Europe, we're starting to see in some places the push in the other direction already. And that's something to watch because it creates those stresses inside Europe and the inability of the Europeans to stay together. Without the United States playing a strong role in trying to shape it. And for me, that's the big thing to take away when you think about the structure of the world. We are 5 or 10 years out from the next balance. There's no center of gravity of the world system right now. The United States is sort of running its way. The Europeans don't have unity. The Russians have theirs. The Chinese are doing this. It hasn't come back into a new sort of structured balance. All of the middle powers are moving around trying to find how they can position themselves. The outcome of all of these new trade deals and negotiations and things hasn't fully manifested itself. There's no global leadership that I can see that is bringing everybody along or trying to. And I think that we're going to have to wait another 1 or 2 political cycles for that to reemerge. So for everybody here, it's going to be fun.
Roger Baker, thank you very much, sir. Thanks a lot. Thank you, guys.
Скальная горизонтально, закрыта.